At Brands Hatch, the event is the Slick 50 Formula Ford World Championship. Drivers throughout the world have been competing all year to get to this event, and by the end of this programme we will know who is the winner of this year's Formula Ford World Championship.
And it was 30 years ago, on July the 2nd, 1967, that the most successful junior single-seater category in the world actually started at Brands Hatch, would you believe? And certainly the first race involved 14 cars, and it was won by a gentleman called Ray Allen. And that series went on, as we know, to become very, very successful and mushroomed into one of the most successful formulas in the whole world. And obviously it's very nice to see about 500 drivers who've been trying to get into these Formula Ford World Finals, literally racing all over Europe and in Canada and in America in order to get through to win this very prestigious prize. And of course we've been talking about Formula One as well. And it may be interesting for you to know that Emerson Fittipaldi, James Hunt, Jody Scheckter, Ayrton Senna, Nigel Mansell, Michael Schumacher and Damon Hill have all raced in Formula Ford in varying degrees of success over the years. So it speaks for itself that with drivers like that and the sort of heritage like that, obviously it can only go from strength to strength. Well, I have with me Jason Campbell, who's the worldwide coordinator for Formula Ford, and obviously it's a pretty big title, Jason, but it does mean just that, doesn't it?
Well, it does. Formula Ford is a truly international formula. It's one that spans the globe, over 20 countries in all 5 continents. It's racing which has been around since 1967 and has grown and flourished. We've today got over 500 drivers contesting the Slick 50 Formula Ford World Series.
Now obviously there was a slight hiccup with Formula Ford in '93 when the old Kent engine was replaced by the new engine. Obviously that was because that was becoming an outdated engine and Ford didn't want to have an old engine running around its race cars. Apart from that little hiccup, 30 years is a big success story, isn't it?
It's a fantastic success story, one that no other manufacturer can emulate, and I wouldn't call it a hiccup, 30 years, the change from Kent to Z-Tech. It's an evolutionary process, as all championships have to go through it. We're now using the more modern 1.8-litre Z-Tech engine, which powers the car, a very quick engine, very reliable. Teams have found it a big improvement.
And obviously it's a quicker engine than the old Kent engine.
It is quicker. The cars today will be reaching speeds of about 130 miles an hour. And some of the circuits will get up to 150 miles an hour. And it's very reliable. It's one of the things that's helped make Formula Ford a cheap way to go motor racing.
And of course, as one of the prizes for the festival is a drive in the Stewart Grand Prix Formula One car, of course it's not unusual to find Jackie Stewart down here as well. And of course, 3 times world champion Jackie had his own views on what makes Formula Ford successful.
Well, the Slick 50 Formula Ford Championship, I think, is one of the most important events in the calendar year now for young drivers to show themselves and to be put into a situation where it's really launching their future career. Because there's not a racing driver, spotter, if you like, that wouldn't be here today. And of course, what happens next by the winner getting £20,000, a test in the Paul Stewart Racing Formula 3 car and a ride in the Formula 1 car. I mean, it's a terrific opportunity for a young driver. So I think I'm really enjoying it. I've enjoyed the racing so far. It's been fantastic. And, you know, it's just, I mean, it's great close racing.
Well, obviously in the Formula One, the Stewart Formula One team now, you've got 2 ex-Formula Ford drivers, obviously. So obviously you support the championship very, very completely. But certainly as an expert, motor racing expert, what would you say was the reason for the success? Because 30 years is an awfully long time for a formula to keep going.
I think the stability of the formula has been its currency, really. And the races have been well handled in a variety of different countries. I mean, it's a totally global formula, and it's the only global formula, I think, at this end of the sport. So I think that it's been a tremendous benefit to motorsport to bring along young talents. And if you look at the record, it's produced most of the top Formula One champions, probably coming after me, because Formula Ford wasn't in existence when I started. But it's a tremendous formula. I mean, Formula Ford really marks the card from the beginning of a single-seater racing driver.
And the boss of Andy Walsh Racing, Andy Walsh himself, was very kind to give us some of his very hectic scheduled time down at Brands, because obviously he's running 5 cars at the festival, and obviously that means that he hasn't really got a lot of spare time to talk to journalists like me.
Well, Andy, obviously in the 30 years Formula Ford has been going, it's changed considerably, and probably more so in the last couple of years when the engine's actually been changed over. From an engineering point of view, what sort of change has this made to you as a team? Have you had to sort of change your philosophy on Formula Ford completely, or what have you had to do?
I think the nature of the championship changed a little bit. It's a lot more technical nowadays. The dampers are free in the technical regulations, so we're probably using dampers that Formula One had 5 years ago in Formula Ford, which has always been considered to be the learning formula. So it's quite technical now. It's hard work for them, but that's how it should be.
So not only for you as an engineer, it's the drivers that have got a problem with telling you, the engineer, what the problem is when they're out on the track.
Yes, of course. I mean, we're learning as well. Formula Ford's for mechanics, for engineers, and for drivers. So it's, but it's a good proving ground because the regulations are strict but free in some areas, which you need to know about if you're going to find the last few tenths in the car.
Which is what it's all about, isn't it?
Yeah.
So what other things are you looking at when obviously you've got a driver, you come down here to Brands Hatch, it's the first time a driver's been round here, and he comes back into you as an engineer and says, oh, don't know what it's handling. What happens then?
Well, the first step is teaching the driver what the car can do, and there's no point making detailed changes with basically a good setup on a car when they haven't learned the circuit. So you have to go through a phase of not ignoring their comments, noting their comments, but teaching them that their input as a driver obviously affects the way the car handles. So it's a balance between a human being and a machine, and you have to find the perfect balance between the two. It's basically a steel tubular space frame chassis. They allow you to use a casting to connect the gearbox to the engine, which is also a stressed member of the chassis. It basically is part of the chassis, the gearbox and bell housing behind the engine, which the rear suspension's attached to. The engine is basically a production engine used in the Mondeo and Escort. It's a 1.8 Zetec. Produces in this form, in the Formula Ford, produces about 150 brake horsepower.
Well, in motor racing, it's all very well having the fastest engine and the fastest driver, but when it comes down to it, there's one very important link to the track, and that is the tyres. Well, this year, Avon are obviously supporting the Formula Ford Championship again at the World Finals, and I have with me Eddie Wood, who's the general manager of Avon. Well, Eddie, what is the main sort of problem with supplying so many tyres to so many cars throughout Europe?
I don't think it's a problem. It's one of those nice problems that you have. We send tyres into Europe, and we have distributors who do the service in the various countries like France, Germany, Sweden, Benelux, and we actually do the service to the British Championship ourselves. So we have our own service crew who go to each race meeting.
So on something like, just say, the British Championship, say the average car, the average driver for the whole round of the actual Formula Ford Championship, how many tyres will they actually use during the year?
Well, they're allowed 6 tyres for each event, so if you multiply that by the number of events, let's say 20 events, you've got sort of 120, but they also use some tyres for testing as well. So you could run into probably 150 tyres in the year.
As we've seen looking at some of the cars, you can understand how difficult it is to make these cars competitive, because if a driver makes the wrong decision in testing, then certainly that will be reflected in a bad race result, and of course that will reflect badly on the team as well as the driver. And certainly that is one of the things that drivers are trying to avoid. They are trying to get success, so obviously they're going to put a lot of time into testing to make sure that when they actually come to the race, the car is set up absolutely perfectly for their first race decision.
Brands Hatch has always been one of the best race circuits in the world, in my opinion, and certainly when you see some of the racing you're going to see later on in the programme, you'll understand why, because the Indy circuit is perhaps one of the finest circuits for developing a driver's skills. There's very few places where you can overtake safely, but there's a lot of places where you can try if you feel inclined to. And certainly these guys in Formula Ford know what they're doing, and it's very interesting when they find different lines around Druids Bend and Paddock Bend at the start of the race. And as you'll see in part 2, this racing is close and it is very exciting.